Hey there, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at Barbados. You hear the name, you probably think beaches, holidays.
Paradise, right.
Exactly. But the sources you brought us, these articles, research notes, they tell a much deeper, more turbulent story, don't they? About transformation.
They really do. It's a fascinating look at how profoundly an island, its environment, its society could be reshaped.
So that's our mission here, really, to use this material as our map and, peel back those layers, understand the radical change Barbados went through. Because it wasn't always the island we picture today. Far from it.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is how these sources highlight the specifics, the choices made, the economic drivers, the human cost, turning it into this sort of, well, a blueprint for other colonies in the New World, for better and often for worse.
It's a story, it seems, of incredible wealth built on, well, incredible loss and change. Okay, let's unpack this then. Before all that, before sustained European colonization, what did Barbados actually look like, feel like? Because the sources paint a very different picture than, say, an empty island.
Oh, completely different. Forget the kind of dry landscape you might associate with sugar plantations later on. Your sources describe a dense, tropical rainforest. We're talking a two-tiered canopy, trees over 100 feet tall.
Wow.
Yeah, things like locust, mastic, calabash trees. And crucially, it was wet. The sources mention roaring rivers.
Roaring rivers.
On Barbados.
Fed by massive springs, vast wetlands, mangroves all along the coast, wide sandy beaches, thriving coral reefs offshore. It was this incredibly complex, rich ecosystem. Loads of animal life, too.
That's incredible. A totally different world. And the sources mention different forest types, too, right? Depending on the terrain.
Exactly. Dry forests, semi-wet forests, swamp forests. It shows real ecological variety. And importantly, humans were there before the Europeans arrived in force. Evidence goes way back, maybe 2400 BC.
Right, but more recently. Well, the Arawaks were there, maybe from around 200 BC. They called it Ilaro, the Island of the Blessed. And they practiced shifting agriculture, using the land, but sort of working with the forest, not clearing it wholesale.
Okay.
Then later, the Caribs, who called it Batu, they introduced crops like cassava, hunted, fished, used the wood. But the sources suggest maybe the Arawaks had already left by the time the Caribs were dominant there, finding it, quote, unpopulated. So human presence, yes, but maybe not continuous large-scale settlement reshaping the whole island.
Gotcha. So people were using it, but not that kind of total transformation that came later. The sources also mentioned those really early European drive-bys almost.
Yeah, fleeting visits.
Yeah.
Juan de la Cosa for Spain in 1492. Claimed it, looked for gold, found none, shipwrecked even.
And Columbus around the same time.
Same year, second expedition, but yeah, aborted mission for Barbados itself. It really highlights what the Spanish were after.
Gold,
Yeah.
no gold, no interest.
Yeah, pretty much. So this incredibly rich island, ecologically speaking, was left largely unpopulated by Europeans for like a century after that. They just moved on.
But the Portuguese stopped by.
Right, for supplies, water, maybe food. That's supposedly where the name Barbados comes from, the bearded fig trees. And they did make one change, the sources note, introducing wild hogs for future hunting. A small tweak, but an early sign of introduced species.
Okay, so the stage is set. Rich island, indigenous history, fleeting European interest. Until the British.
Here's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Early 1600s, how do they see it?
Well, the sources show this really interesting dual perspective. On one hand, they saw this untouched wilderness, a new Eden, a blank slate just waiting for them.
That terra nullius idea again, empty land.
Exactly. But on the other hand, some descriptions called it low and flat, maybe even trifling compared to volcanic islands. So there's this mix of seeing, like, alien beauty, but also a kind of barbaric savagery in the untamed nature, a land to be conquered and improved in their view, despite the evidence of prior people and that complex ecosystem we just talked about. So, 1627, the sources say, Henry Powell lands, the first proper English settlement at the Great Hull. What did they try first?
Initially, tobacco. That was the cash crop elsewhere. Also, salt production, tried some shipbuilding. They started clearing land, building houses, farms, letting livestock wander. And the sources actually say that the environmental damage was relatively slow at first with tobacco.
But it wasn't an overnight clear cut.
No. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it was a phase of experimentation. Your sources list tobacco, cotton, indigo, ginger. They were trying to figure out what would grow well and make money.
And tobacco didn't quite work out.
No. The sources point to a couple of things. One was the wide-scale deforestation for agricultural land. Even the early clearing had an impact. But also, they just didn't really understand the specific soils, the climate. They lacked that local knowledge.
Which leads them eventually to the big one, sugar, late 1630s.
Bingo. And the sources are clear. They learned how to make it work by looking at what was happening in Brazil, where sugar was already booming. They borrowed that knowledge.
And sugar wasn't just another crop, was it? The sources really stress how different its demands were.
Oh, fundamentally different. The ecological change required was, as your sources put it, radical and rapid. It wasn't just clearing fields. You had to cut down pretty much all the forest.
All of it.
Virtually all. To fuel the boiling houses, to make space, you had to reroute watercourses. Your sources state that by 1660, just a few decades later, that lush rainforest island was basically gone, replaced by a dry and arid patchwork of sugar plantations.
Why?
Sugar just had these greater exigencies, as one source puts it. It needed windmills, boiling houses, huge amounts of water, constant supplies of wood fuel, and this relentless need for more land as soils got exhausted. It drove the scramble for fresh land and water.
And the money rolled in.
Immediately. The sources give examples, like a guy named Crook, making 45,000 pounds, an astronomical sum back then, from just 40 or 50 acres in 1641. It showed the incredible profit potential.
And it's interesting, the sources note that at first, these were relatively small operations, like small plantations run by one or two people with a labor force of up to 10 slaves. That scale was about to explode, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Because the profits were there, but the labor needed was immense.
So what does this all mean? This shift to sugar, it wasn't just about the environment. It fundamentally ripped up and rebuilt the society on Barbados.
Completely. Your sources are very direct about this. The sheer labor needed for sugarcane cultivation and processing forced the adoption of African slavery in Barbados before anywhere else in the New World. It was the engine that required enslaved labor on a massive scale.
Before anywhere else. That's significant.
Hugely significant. What's fascinating here is how Barbados then became the template, the model for all subsequent colonies in the Americas, for how to set up and run a slave-based plantation society. The legal codes, the social structures.
And the scale of importation was massive.
Staggering. The sources talk about tens of thousands arriving just in the first few decades, and it just kept accelerating. They targeted West Africa specifically, where complex societies and existing trade networks, unfortunately, made large-scale capture and transport possible for the Europeans.
And the human cost. The sources don't shy away from that.
No. They mention at least 80,000 people dying just on the Middle Passage ships en route to Barbados. And the few indigenous people who might have remained were, quote, virtually eradicated by disease and the brutal work regime.
This created that stark social structure the sources describe. A white minority ruling a black majority. Like massively skewed. What were the numbers?
By 1698, yeah, the sources say something like 127,000 enslaved people compared to maybe 10,000 whites. A huge imbalance. And it's worth noting, the sources mention these enslaved people came from diverse African ethnic backgrounds, bringing their own cultures, languages, skills, the seeds of the Bajan culture to come. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that massive imbalance, that tiny minority ruling a vast oppressed majority, fueled intense fear among the planters, fear of revolt.
Which led to?
Which, according to your sources, directly led to the increasing severity of slave codes, harsher laws, stricter controls, more power given to overseers, anything to maintain control and suppress potential resistance.
And it's clear from the sources, this massive need for sugar labor was the reason for switching away from indentured servants, who had initially been used, to relying almost entirely on enslaved Africans, though some Amerindian slaves were also present early on.
Yes. The sheer scale and brutality required for sugar just wasn't sustainable with indentured servitude. And the planters were constantly trying to maximize profit, looking for ways to make the system more efficient, like developing better sugar mills, to extract more value from the land and the forced labor.
But even within that incredibly brutal system, the sources make it clear, there was resistance. Booth's rebellion in 1816, that stands out.
It really does. The sources call it the first serious rebellion in Barbados. It shows that the desire for freedom, the resistance, was always there, simmering beneath the surface.
Tell us more about what the sources say happened.
Well, it was led by an enslaved man named Bizako, involved about 400 other enslaved people. They strategically targeted plantations, burning cane fields, destroying property.
And the sources mentioned planning, right? It wasn't just a random outburst.
Exactly. That's key. Clandestine meetings, specifically at a place called Chase's house. They set a date Whit Monday, a specific time, 5:30 p.m. They organized.
What kind of actions did they take?
Things like obscuring the windmill so signals couldn't be sent, knocking down blocks, mustering fighters in the bush. They burned the master's house, destroyed the cool room where sugar was processed. It was a direct attack on the system's infrastructure. Your sources mention a mix of actions. Some note the insurgents showed humanity, but also that Busa sought vengeance later.
And Busa himself.
He wasn't captured immediately. The sources say he led attacks, took refuge with followers in the bush. Later reports just mention him being in custody, suspected. But the impact, the sources say it shook the then 172-year-old slave society to its core.
Wow. Even though suppressed, it sent a powerful message.
Absolutely. It showed the profound resistance against what one source calls the harsh, albeit liberating, situation. A grim reality, but the fight for liberation was undeniable.
Okay, so moving forward into the 19th century, emancipation comes in 1834. But it wasn't quite freedom overnight, was it?
No, not at all. The sources describe the colonial government grappling with how to abolish slavery but keep the sugar economy running because it was still vital. So they implemented this system called apprenticeship.
Which was basically
continued unpaid labor, essentially. Former slaves were forced to keep working on the plantations for a period of years. It was freedom in name, but not yet in practice for many.
What's fascinating here is how the formerly enslaved people reacted. Did they just accept this?
Not passively, no. The sources detail how they actively sought better options. Many refused to do the unpaid field work on the sugar estates. They started moving away, maybe to upland areas, more wooded spots, trying to grow their own food crops.
Seeking independence?
Exactly, or trying to learn skilled trades. They started establishing their own little settlements, hamlets, often in marginal areas like mangrove swamps that the plantations didn't want. They were carving out their own spaces.
And this had an effect on the sugar industry.
A direct effect. Your sources link this withdrawal of labor directly to the sugar system struggling in the decade after emancipation. Planters suddenly found themselves without the readily available, coerced workforce they depended on.
So what did the planters do?
They tried to find other sources of cheap labor. First, they looked for white indentured servants again, but that didn't really work out. Eventually, after protests, they started allowing non-indentured laborers to come from places like China and India.
And politically, things started to shift too, slowly.
Yes, the sources mention gradual reforms, loosening the absolute power held during slavery, slowly expanding voting rights. Initially, these reforms often still served planter interests, like needing financial backing, which tied into voting qualifications. But it did change things.
Numbers changed dramatically.
Yeah, the sources show a big jump in registered voters right after emancipation, and then a huge expansion by the 1850s, reaching something like 80% of adults, which is quite remarkable for the time, following further reforms.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. The sources touch on the early 20th century WWI, bringing hardships, some riots leading to reforms, then post-World War II.
Yeah, a period of growing discord, changing attitudes globally about colonialism, the rise of the UN, ideas about self-determination starting to take root more firmly.
Which leads us eventually to
independence,
Yeah.
November 30th, 1966, a huge milestone, obviously. Your sources note the Constitution shortly after established a bicameral legislature, the system of government.
And what's fascinating here, looking at the more modern era in the sources, is how the economy continued to evolve, right?
Yeah.
Sugar wasn't king forever.
No, its dominance faded. The sources mention it stagnated later on, especially compared to places like Jamaica. There was this tension between sugar profits and, say, rum production proceeds. Modern Barbados, the sources describe, relies heavily on tourism as a key pillar.
But agriculture's still there.
Oh, yes, but diversified. Commercial tea, rice, ground provisions, things like red kidney beans, all supporting, especially, the culinary arts scene, which is important for tourism, too.
And culture.
Yeah.
The sources talk about how it wasn't just imitation of England forever.
Right. Initially, yes, a lot of mimicry fashion, food, houses, even gardens trying to replicate England. But the sources emphasize how a distinctly Bajan culture emerged over centuries through adaptation and, crucially, fusion.
Fusion of what?
Primarily the incredibly strong African roots of the majority population, blending over time with European influences, and later contributions from Chinese and Indian communities as well. It's a Creole culture.
And music is a big part of that.
Huge. The sources trace the evolution from calypso to soca, the importance of dance halls, even the influence of church schools. And there's this interesting discussion in the sources about what counts as folk culture. Is it just stuff from before the plantations?
Oh,
Or is it the dynamic culture created by Black Barbadians under and after slavery? Things like the traditional Bacho pantomime and, of course, crop over the massive festival rooted in the end of the sugar harvest and its music. It's vibrant. The sources really point to that Afrocentric identity as the core, the root of it all.
and cricket. Can't forget cricket.
Definitely not. The dynamic between cricket and calypso soca is part of the cultural landscape.
The sources also bring us right up to contemporary challenges, especially environmental ones.
Yes, balancing development with sustainability. They mention national goals aligned with sustainable development, disaster preparedness, crucial for an island, but also specific controversies like proposals for coastal road projects, say at Clinkets or Mullins Bay,
What are the concerns there?
dredging, dumping fill, coastal erosion, the potential impact on beaches and marine life, often linked to tourism infrastructure like cruise ships. But they also mention protective measures like the National Park System and Environmental Management Acts.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, that history we've discussed, the dramatic reshaping of the land for sugar, the society built on slavery, it's not just in the past, is it? It echoes in these modern debates about land use, economy, identity.
Absolutely. The legacy of that profound transformation, both environmental and social, is still being navigated today. How the island manages its resources, defines its future, understands its unique culture, it's all deeply connected to that history your sources lay out.
Wow. It really is an incredible story when you trace it back using these sources. From that lush, seemingly pristine rainforest island known to the Arawaks and Caribs, touched by the Spanish and Portuguese.
To being utterly remade by British sugar planters, built on the backs of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans.
Through resistance, emancipation, struggle, adaptation.
To becoming an independent nation, now grappling with that complex legacy, its unique cultural identity, and the ongoing challenges of sustainability in the modern world.
Your sources really highlight that duality, don't they? Periods of staggering wealth and global importance, right alongside devastating environmental change and profound social injustice and struggle.
It's stark. The pursuit of that sugar wealth fundamentally reshaped everything: the land, the people, the future.
It's a powerful, sometimes difficult, but ultimately fascinating narrative. Thank you for bringing these sources and walking us through this deep dive into Barbados' history.
My pleasure. It's a history with lessons that resonate far beyond its shores.
Definitely. And maybe to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over, stemming from all this material. Considering Barbados' intense history, where its environment and society were so drastically altered by external demands, mainly Europe's desire for sugar, what responsibility, if any, does the wider world have today in supporting its efforts towards sustainable development and the preservation of its unique cultural heritage? Something to think about.